Hello everyone, today we talk about migration era weaponry and armor, and especially emphasizing the methodological difficulties that we have in interpreting especially the archaeological finds, but not only, also the literary evidence. This is a particularly important chapter. You know that we discussed the migration era quite extensively at some point, in the sense that we traced a big picture. I don't know how many videos we made about migration era, like 20 or something. There's a playlist dedicated to it, and you realize that in all of these videos we essentially discussed about the ambiguities that we are presented with historically every time we try to assess more concretely what this period in itself, but we can't call it migration era, but it's really we have similar problems also for many other periods, telling the truth, and in especially assessing what the concrete political and social reality of these worlds was. And when it comes to military aspects, this is often hotly debated because there is a sort of attention towards the material side of the story. Thanks my eyes. I mean, the overwhelming evidence that we have from this period is chiefly archaeological, right? And for the early Middle Ages, basically we observe the world more through the lenses of kind of the ancient world, methodologically speaking, than the high medieval and later medieval ones that are massively more documented. And we definitely come across certain limits, of course, that we have in defining in assessing, let's say, what the reality of this world really was. And as you know, I have had my very modest and humble share of history, let's say, strictly meant in this period. I studied in detail the Longobard warfare, essentially, and observed it chiefly for the sake of trying to trace an evolution, and at the beginning also trying to characterize a little bit more the Longobards in that specific case compared to other peoples. And this was several years ago, and that experience was great because studying this moment in history, I realized that actually the differences between all of these peoples weren't probably that big. And going on, as we have seen recently, with especially within the von Clausewitz series, there is perhaps a technologistic prejudice when we come to study, especially the certain types of evidence that, of course, is the archaeological one. I don't want to sound as if I have bias against archaeology, because that there is this inherent kind of I don't know even how to define this sort of enmity between archaeologists and historians, even if they are technically the same people, just with different specific tools, information, but our works are really the same, because objectively, when you have a real material evidence and you can study it, you can assess it under quite even physical, sensual point of view, you get amazed. You can't avoid to look at, I don't know, the Sutton Hoo's finds and saying, oh wow, this is amazing, and fixating on them for sheer beauty of such finds, etc. But there is, in my opinion, an over-reliance on the effective doubting and let's say of diversification of the finds on a critical base. Explaining myself better, what I really mean is that of course war is made with means of offense and defense, and we can't look at weapons and armor as if each and every piece had definitely a story and a function, and it can tell us really so much about how this stuff was made, what for, etc. But we shouldn't let's say, indulge into thinking that in that world the differences were so overwhelming in practice as to kind of stereotype, for example, one people in a certain way or in another. Naturally, every people had its own differences, etc., but we're talking about a pre-industrial world. In situations in Europe that were fundamentally very similar to each other, today we will look at the so-called Germanic or Latin Germanic Europe, so mostly Northern Europe and certain parts of Spain and Italy. But the concept here is realizing that even beyond this world and with other populations, the differences weren't so striking after all, and that probably one of the major differences in this sense was rather the centralization and the nomadic lifestyle. I say this for two reasons. First of all, the first one is that objectively we can't trace at this point of a kind of a really Germanic character of a certain type of warfare, right? We can observe it from a tribal point of view, for example. We can confrontate it with, for example, the Roman armies of the time, even with the nomadic peoples, and surely we find a lot of things that are present in there in common. I don't think there is, for example, it doesn't make excessive sense to compare, I don't know, a 6th century, say, Longobard Arimanus and a Byzantine Cavallarius, and saying, well, these are essentially two different things, because conceptually they were pretty similar. And the interesting thing about this is that they came from, say, two different paths, because naturally the Longobard warrior didn't have the same lifestyle or beliefs or mentality of a, let's say, I don't know, a Greek cavalryman or a Bucellarius that followed certain regimes in a certain particular world of long sedentarization, written culture, etc. But ironically, but also especially interestingly and logically, they produced essentially the same type of warrior, right? And I'm not kidding. Like, if you look at what the average Germanic warrior essentially was about, you observe that it was definitely immersed into a world of warfare since he was born, right? The concept here of that is behind the world migration era is that these populations, aside from, of course, being set in motion by other peoples, the domino effect brought by the Hunnic invasions, etc., was essentially aimed at getting better land, right? And that's what essentially, before the arrival of the Huns, telling the truth, the Romans had effectively prevented, right? If the Huns had not come from the steppes, objectively, the Roman Empire in the West would have not crumbled. Like, there would have been an easy way at some point to contain these movements, to partly integrate the Germans or whatever they you want to picture them, because there is also this great problem. What is Germanic at this time? We don't know. It's only from the 6th century that the same what we called and were called by the Romans and the Greeks Germans at the time began, right? And especially through acquainting the same Roman world at that time, to define themselves, to identify as Germans, right? And this goes in parallel with the creation of the introduction of a written culture in their societies, or better, in the sedentarization of these groups into lands where this was the norm, right? So even when we look, but this can fit when we talk about material culture, especially, can fit very broadly into many other contexts. Take the Romans and the Germans as two different but at the same time not so distant people in practice, right? Always remember this. It's not that, I don't know, the Roman legionary in absolute terms was the absolute disciplined and absolute collective-minded individual, and the Germanic warrior was the completely individualistic and unruly and undisciplined individual. I mean, there were many middle grounds, and the asymmetry in these, Iron Age contexts was definitely very, very low compared to many other ages in history, which we actually don't give a damn much about differences. And the reason is we see this difference is naturally that, first of all, the same Romans and eventually the Germans at one point tried to stress it. Tomorrow we will see it better because I want to talk about the Renovatio Imperii and how the Germans kind of related themselves with the concept of the Imperium, but we'll see it tomorrow. But in terms of, the Romans liked to stress at limits of even a kind of definitely at the stereotypical level, at least, the fact that Romans and Germans were essentially something so opposite and so different and so morally different, because that was at the end of the day the real story. But the reality wasn't so, and in their cases of their warfare, this is particularly evident in material culture, because both these peoples actually took a lot, and we know it, from Celtic warfare, right? Celtic armament and weaponry. And they came essentially from the same thing. If you look at the 4th century, either Roman legionnaire or Germanic warrior, you see that they're essentially using Celtic, or in large part Celtic-derived weaponry, and they have essentially grown together in the absorption and in the development, and also of the enhancement, of course, of pre-existing material cultures that have developed in a certain sense. The Romans, ever since their foundation, have always been more advanced, materially speaking, than the Celts, and a few exceptions in certain types of technology doesn't change the fact that the Mediterranean world was dramatically more advanced for those time standards than Central Europe. In part because the Central Europe at one point during Bronze Age, even the Iron Age, wasn't like bunch of with the Third World with just ugly, wild and barbarians covered in fur and shouting, and there was a civilization there too. But the Germans instead were more like that. Like if you look at the Germans that the Romans met for the first time during the 1st century BC, the end of the 2nd, and in the 1st century BC, well, those were really rough. Those were really primitive, and their improvement in this regard of actual coordination, political and social structuring, etc., came along with the contact with the Celts, definitely, and later with the Romans. But a lot of factors were blended in, and what you get during the migration era is this dramatically homogeneous pattern, in my opinion, that you can find beyond even the Romano-Germanic world. I mean, if you look, for example, at the role of cavalry, that at this time doesn't definitely have that terrific importance it would start gaining from the 8th century onwards. Certain methods, techniques, and technologies proper, and mindsets and trainings were quite shared, even beyond, even North Africa and the Near East, the Middle East, the steppes, and so on. And this was reflected in a situation that had been quite dramatic, quite turbulent, objectively. The Roman Empire had disgregated, and this is the major problem, right? When a big empire crumbles, or however gets resized, and it also leaves room to others, because also this is what technically how the Roman Empire kind of shrunk in this sense. It's not that it fell, of course it didn't. Just the western part basically evaporated in different measures, and we have seen actually how much continuity there is. Even the Romano-Germanic kingdoms with the Roman element, that was the one that effectively gave these kingdoms a a unity, a structure, a certain degree of centralization that the Germanic peoples had never had before, but together with lots of other things. But you realize that these other populations had, in fact, to fit in a world that, coming from the outskirts of Europe or even of Africa or the Near East, that they had to fit into a world that was essentially already civilized, that already had its own structures, infrastructures, and productions, and surplus rates in production, etc. Thinking about the Ostrogoths, that they basically seize Italy on behalf of Constantinople, and they use the Roman fabricae armorum, and they keep using essentially Roman weaponry, and that's basically what they do. And as we were saying before, it doesn't even make sense to distinguish at that point between a Germanic weaponry or a Roman weaponry. On Schwerpunkt, we haven't. It doesn't make sense more than much. There is actually a huge literature about this, and on Schwerpunkt we still haven't dealt with that, with metallurgy especially, and and that's where you get to the problems in sources interpretation, because sources are naturally biased. At this time in history, there is nothing like a independent thought, and especially from an historiographical point of view, you don't get it. It wasn't part of those people's mind, especially now in the 6th century. Things had even regressed, if there had ever been a kind of a balance in that regard, towards a kind of a more authoritarian view of politics, of society, etc. But aside from that, which is also debatable, of course, but at that point, for example, there is all this great encomiums of the Goths at one point in Italy. Think about Cassiodorus, etc., that produced this enormous amount of literature that was in a certain degree put at the service of the ruling class of the actually the Goths shared the control of Italy with the senatorial elite, so that's a very peculiar situation. But that's why, in fact, we have individuals like Cassiodorus that wrote in favor of the Goths as Roman senators, and for example, inventing, constructing even this great superiority of, for example, of Gothic warfare. The same concept of Goths, telling the truth. We made 2 videos last Christmas holidays about Ostrogoths and Visigoths, and we pointed out that even the same names of these peoples are actually quite debatable. They were called like that. They quite didn't conceive themselves as such until they were incorporated, especially in countries like in Southern Europe, like countries, in fact, respectively like Italy and Spain, that were massively Romanized, and that were during the reign of these peoples, actually they maintained probably the highest degree of Romanization was around there, and especially of Latin Romanization, while objectively the Eastern Roman Empire was becoming something else, culturally speaking, on a more strictly Hellenic cultural base, let's say. But the concept is that, for example, the Cassiodorus wrote a lot of things in favor of, Germanic blades, right? And this idea that the Germans at that point produced this incredibly good weaponry that was, capable of cutting, everything, this beautiful steel, we can call it, even though there is enormous debate of what is steel, what is not. From a strictly chemical point of view, that was steel, but for modern standards, that is ridiculous. It's kind of a very low level of quality level. But the concept of the time was that we live of these cliches of saying, that author wrote that, and how much, for example, archaeological evidence we have of this superiority. How can we test it? How can we effectively acknowledge it with such scanty evidence overall, and with the simple answer is that many of these statements are generalizations, and even when we enter more into the technicalities, for example, of the use of weaponry, whichever they were, thinking about the Francisca or the Angun or the Scramasax, whatever, we still don't understand clearly how these weapons actually fitted into migration era warfare, right? Aside from the obvious, the essential. I mean, it's obvious that these weapons had a specific function, but for which they were designed. But when it comes to say, okay, but how was reality? How did this fit? I mean, how even just not from a strictly, in fact, technical point of view, but a strictly political and social point of view, how were the armies that were levied at this time, that fought, that were, and there is a great margin of unknown in this. So of course, when we look at these objects, we have to understand that it's meant that we're using them. So you can't frame them just into the strictly technical picture. You must realize that, first of all, as we will see now, they are just a part of what existed at the time. Secondly, we don't know much about how they were effectively made, by whom, for which use in that specific typology, given that most of this stuff actually comes from burials, right? And that's that's not necessarily what you would think it was used on the field, in the sense that, of course, they were the same weapons, but maybe they were just more representative, ceremonial. And how frequent were they? And how many people effectively could afford certain weapons, and how many couldn't? We don't know the answer to these questions. So qualitatively and quantitatively, these means are expression of the technical level of the society that produced them, of the warrior uses of and customs of the peoples that used them, of the initiatives and of the reactions, let's say, both of the individuals and of the communities, and even actually of the constituted powers that could produce them, right? And so under many points of view, of course, history of war is the history of techniques, right, and of technology. But at the same time, we must realize that the material dimension is not the only one. When we need to think exactly at the material dimension. And that's the trick. And of course, I don't want to lecture anyone in this sense, because this is pretty obvious, right? We don't study single objects as decontextualized from reality. But I have a great bias, I think, as a historian specifically. That's why I was saying, joking, of course, that thing about archaeologists, because I do feel, in general, that literary sources are overlooked, right? And they're overlooked, underestimated, because naturally they are, first of all, they are few, and scanny, and not very precise. But at the same time, the early Middle Ages have a great advantage that in other periods in history you don't have. That is that in a lifetime you can come to close actually virtually all of the sources of a certain specific context, right? And this doesn't mean that you basically understand everything about them. Actually, that's really impossible in a lifetime, so nobody can. But at the same time, you can more easily adopt a diachronical and comparative picture of this all. And in my opinion, albeit I haven't spent more than some year or so about certain topics, then of course I expanded them over time, but not specifically for anything I had to work with. I think that there is an homogeneous picture of certain things that occur, and there are certain things can be explained, others can't. right? And in the latter case, we have, first of all, in the first case, actually, we have to be humble enough to recognize that we may be wrong all the time, that there is never a full certainty about anything in history, and specifically, I mean, more evidently about these times. In the latter, instead, we have to recognize that, of course, there are these limits, and that we have to learn to coexist with them, not pretending that we can know everything, not pretending that you can substantiate an evidence when that evidence does not exist, right? Not because it's something probable, let's say, but because you know that there are variables in that equation that do not allow you to be reasonably certain about certain things. But this can be extended really to a lot of aspects, and I must confess you that part of the reason why I eventually shifted from the migration period to later time, say in the Low Middle Ages, it's because I found, historiographically speaking, a bit too much of I would say of ideologism. I can say this. Not because I don't have trust or respect or admiration, for that matter, for some great names and scholars and many other, even younger and less experienced researchers that, however, produce amazing stuff. But because I think that it's natural that when you have objectively covered the overwhelming majority of sources, historiographically speaking, and you want to keep writing on certain aspects, sometimes let's say the criticism starts taking directions that I don't think are very healthy from a intellectually honest point of view in research. I feel as if certain for example, there is this taste, especially for this period that we discussed on other occasions. Since something, for example, is not proven cent for cent, you can't even speak about it. So the excess of what we were saying, of the opposite, what we were saying before, that not only, well, of course, you should be very careful with whatever you say if you don't have a direct evidence of it. But even if you don't have the certainty, well, you should forget about that, because it's just an hypothesis, and therefore it's valid like all the others. I don't think so. I think hypotheses are made because they there are better and worse hypotheses, and there are hypotheses that, as let's say unconfirmed and probably non-demonstrable as such, are actually very good ones, and you can treat them always with a certain amount of care in the construction of a broader theory, right? And this, in my opinion, is also the fact that there is so much attention, especially from a military point of view, to the strictly material dimension, because objectively, we must rely in proportion a lot on that. I wouldn't like it, let's say, to obscure instead other aspects that are kind of very, very far from the material dimension of the story, and that can be found in many references, etc. But probably actually certain technological history is being neglected in part. I mean, even if there are naturally certain, for example, think about zootechnics. How many people, how many archaeologists are actually, studying migration are really specialized in this? I mean, they are aware at least about these aspects, because, for example, there is this enormous debate on how cavalry was spread during the migration here within certain peoples, right? There are the ideas about the so-called Germanic peoples spans between kind of an almost or quasi-nomadic Reiter Völker, let's say we can like this, and it to actually a more kind of sedentary-like element. And I'm personally very, very into this, because I believe that especially certain populations that materially speaking, have been massively and evidently influenced, and we know it archaeologically speaking, from the Eastern tradition of the steppe, actually weren't that kind of equestrian looking overall than what is being conceived. And this has to do a lot, and that's where it gets ideological, because at the end of the day, the great attention that there is on these subjects, especially from, let's say, I don't know, from the 80s, from maybe before the 70s, when we have started redrawing a bit this stereotypical picture of the Germans countering rightfully that kind of nationalistic approach to and the prejudices that had emerged from that. That included a certain mental, sclerotization and certain prejudices and ideas have began, however, from the other side, also for equally kind of ideological reasons. I mean, maybe not equally. There surely was a much healthier current than the nationalistic one. It was naturally also older, so kind of less outdated by many standards. And there is still today, in fact, for example, late antiquity, in academically speaking, is dramatically exploited today. Like everybody, there is an enormous. It's very fashionable around. I don't know how many books are still written about Constantine. I mean, how much can you write about certain things ad nauseam, really? To points that you start wondering. First of all, naturally, not everything that is written is, an actual great, new, thorough, precise research about something. Much is also just discussing for the sake of discussing. The fact that call for papers now, all globally speaking, have become ridiculous. Frankly, utterly ridiculous. At the point, it's just about writing a sheet of paper just to insert it into, to make it published, to have it published and insert it into your curriculum. But the quality of these papers is sinking. And we are transforming our academies in a circus, in my opinion. But aside from this, let's say that you understand that as if there were this big currents of fashion more than actual precise, definitive interest in settling the matter, right? Trying to get to the point of what it is and not, going straight and saying something concrete about these topics. That is not just the usual cliche. And for example, it happens to me, even reading some of the most famous books, and maybe can be, that might have now 20 years, 30 years on certain subjects. You read them. I don't know. It's maybe because I come from periods where you can really, there are many more sources, therefore the criticism can exponentially grow at that point in depth of insights, etc. But I mean, about this period, there are a lot of banalities that are written, and that of things that at this point have become more about kind of presenting the picture in a mind-blowing term, because you want to break the schemes, right? You want to impress the person that you presume that person is such a bigot and that believes something that is old, and you come there and you open that person's mind with an evidence that is all the contrary. And there are also excesses in that regard, because there's plenty of bigots, it's plenty of people who really don't, not only they don't know history, but they don't want to learn it because they have enormous prejudices. They are either they're racist or they are whatever. And that's why it gets ideological, because from the other side, it becomes like when you lack evidence at a certain quantity, you at one point you start losing time in that and trying to counter a particular vision rather than making a soundly historical criticism from the other side. And it's bad in my opinion. This happens just for making you understand what we're talking about. Of course, even when you have less evidence than this. For example, prehistoric warfare. Prehistoric warfare is a dramatically fascinating field of I don't know how much there is to research there, and I don't know, because I'm very out of it. Well, maybe we can make a video about that at one point. But for example, that field is radically ideologicized from all sides, right? Don't tell me, because at that point it becomes really more of a philosophy of interpretation of certain things. It's not really about the evidence of things that are objectively very difficult, and that therefore would need actually the crossing of many specialists altogether to sort out things that the average historian, and I say it myself as one, that doesn't have. Let's be honest about it. We don't have this terrific education, and we're getting always ever more specialized. As a consequence, now that we should also start reasoning in continental or intercontinental terms when we think of history and what can do with it for the benefit of humanity. I don't know. I don't know anything about China, for example, right? And I can't read, of course, but I don't have the tools. I don't know Chinese, for example. Not that, all historians now should learn everything. It's impossible. But there are certain fields that have remained basically sclerotized within themselves, and instead of saying, like, okay, let's try to expand with the same tools that we already have towards a certain direction, they I think, implode on themselves by saying, okay, well, this is all, it's all a matter of interpretation. It's just this is moral relativism at the end of the day. If you're a historian, you can't. That means first of all giving up, because if you're a true historian, what you want is to get to the freaking answer, and it doesn't matter how you get there as long as it's substantiated, and that's what makes a true historian. Not simply saying, oh well, it's difficult, therefore we have now to reconsider, to refigure, start going on, study something, say something new, but not just from a concrete point of view. Not just saying that the method should be rewritten and just pretending that this is such a deep intellectual realization for which you became the savior of the world for it. If you really want to do something honest and concrete, expand the limits that can be expanded, because I believe that in spite of this lack of evidence, what you can learn overall from even a period like, such a relatively, by the way, undocumented period like the migration era, are enormous. If you try to have a more comprehensive realization of what we are talking about, and that takes a lot of studying, a lot of culture, a lot of an enormous amount of knowledge, quantitatively speaking, which is what historians now don't have anymore. We had this 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago. Now this is disappearing, and especially our generations now are losing this, and it's tragic, because it's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing in this specific historical moment when we need the comprehensive understanding. And now, by the way, we have also way more means. Like today, it's I give you that a lot more has been written than was before. Of course, before historians had it easier because they, much less had been written historiographically speaking. Now it's basically impossible to cover everything. But, in terms of sources, well, this is really not so, because people, like in the past, like this great, scholars from the late 19th to the first half of the 20th century, they had this encyclopedical knowledge about the actual sources. I mean, they knew the sources. And those are basically always the same. They get expanded, whatever, there's more criticism about, but in general, the combinations that you can derive from those are infinite. If you really want to find a specific aspect, let's say that is specific, but maybe not so specific to remain niche, or let's say just something hyper specialistic. We do need, in my opinion, fresh air, new resources. Let's say new moral resources to have the courage of rereading things, but not just lamenting the fact that maybe certain things we got them wrong, but actually capitalizing upon what we already know, which is extraordinarily a lot, and we have technological means that people just, I don't know, 50 years ago would have, just even dreamt of, and go on. And that's what we do. And actually, that's way more surprising than you imagine, because there is really a lot to say more. So, the armament of the barbarians, let's call them in this way for not being too, ethnicistic in, this is really about the Germans, about the Germanic peoples, or the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, if you prefer. I know I'm very Western-centric, but we will expand in about the Byzantine world, the Slavic world. I mean, and this actually fits for broad part also in these areas. So, as we were saying before, the knowledge on the military techniques employed by the barbarians that invaded the Roman West are rather fragmentary, right? And although the information we have on their equipment proper, that is, weaponry and armor, are on average better, or relatively better, and this is thanks to narrative sources. Take Procopius, Gatius, Gregory of Tours, and literary ones, speaking about Beowulf's epopee, or also juridical sources. The Lex Alamanorum, for example, is of dramatic importance. We also have naturally many iconographic and especially archaeological sources, archaeological evidence. So, first of all, we have to give a dimension to this world. Like, objectively, Europe was split in several chunks of populations that settled in an area and that somewhat considered themselves as a group of shared kind of chiefly juridical customs that eventually reflected in different political allegiances, and so on, and that's also a good discriminant in the sense that that is important, and that, especially combined with society, can tell you how, for example, these peoples were stratified. These societies were stratified, how wealth was distributed, which is probably the single most important thing here to really, as an indicator, to understand how these peoples were kept for real, and we can do it with a good degree of certainty by looking at their burials, right? And from my side, for example, when I studied Longobard history, when the Longobards settled in Pannonia, essentially, today's eastern Austria and Low Austria and the Hungarian plain, up to, they bordered in the east and the Carpathian Basin, the Gepids, right? And that the Longobards and the Gepids fought a couple of wars against the other, and with alternate outcomes, and there was all the problem, by the way, that they were starting being framed into the essentially in the Byzantine Commonwealth, let's put it in this way, for which actually Constantinople was quite troubled by the presence of these peoples in the kind of the Illyrian region, and they tried to bring them, to take them from one side to the other. That the Longobards were even sent in Italy to fight with together with Narses against the Ostrogoths, etc. And that's where they probably got the idea of invading Italy afterwards, and probably some of them were already settled in the peninsula even before the bigger chunk. As Byzantine Symmachoi at that point, as the Federati essentially. And the Longobards at this point were, the Gepids were another Germanic people that was probably more substantially mixed, considering that they were both, the Gepids, I think they fit into the Eastern Germanic branch. Even this definition is kind of debatable, because many people consider, for example, also the Longobards as Eastern, Germans. If you split the Germans in two parts, there were the Westerners and the Western and the Eastern, and the Longobards definitely fitted more into the Eastern. But and all the realization at that point that you can see a single generalization how many methodological problems it poses. Because to me, for example, there are three branches actually. There are the Western Germans, then the Elbe Germans, so the Longobards, the Alemanni, the Bavarians. Those are the Elbe Germans, and at least those who remained in the area of Central Europe at that point. And then the Eastern Germans. There are the Goths, basically, as a major group, but also these other individuals. And also this repartition is kind of debatable, meaning what the hell does that mean? I mean, how can you differentiate at one point? Yeah, it seems that there is some kind of linguistical affinity. We do know that the Longobards, for example, kind of spoke kind of like the Alemanni, like the southwestern Germans somewhat do today. And there were also certain Germanic communities in the Alps that now got linguistically extinguished, that were called the Cimbrians actually, but they were something different actually. They came from this specific moment. I think they were Alemanni originally speaking. And when you look at the Longobards and Gepids, you say, well, okay, then how do you differentiate them? How can you say that the Longobards at the end won? The Longobards crushed the Gepids, and they incorporated them, and they brought them in Italy, like Albavin wife was actually the prince. She was the daughter of the Gepid king. It had been slaughtered in battle, right? And these are also pretty tough stories. And you realize at that point there was a sort of affinity, or of this debatable kind of sense of belonging to a certain group that is the Germanic one, and the whole deal with that is probably the Germans. I made a video about this on the early Germanic identity specifically, and to make a synthesis of that, I basically don't think objectively that they called themselves as Germans. Like, they didn't understand, they didn't need that, first of all. But I think they realized that they were kind of more similar to other populations, right? And as from one side you had the Romans, from the other side you had the steppes. Yes, of course, the Romans were some of different peoples themselves, but they were still very different from what the Germans were. So I think when the Germans emerged, especially at the 6th century, out of this, Central European dimension, they began to realize that they objectively were something similar to each other, and they preferred to call themselves in different ways because, of course, their pride, while coexisting with each other, was on a tribal base, on a confederational base. But in my opinion, there is even a level of integrability that must explain certain customs and certain habits. And in my opinion, the Longobards, they are sometimes pictured like a Sarmato-Germanic people because, this influence is chiefly because. Now it gets complicated, but I don't have time. We'll explain it on a video dedicated to the Longobards. But if you look at the track they followed in Central Europe, I mean, they essentially remained always in Germany. At one point, yes, they get here in Austria, in the Pannonian Basin, that is basically the westernmost area of the steppes from Hungary to the Bering Strait. But and that is reflected definitely in their equipment and whatever. We know that the Longobards were probably the Germanic people that remained the longest in absolute terms under the Huns. Even after Attila died, actually, they remained seemingly under their own. His son, and we know that their elite, especially the aristocrats, were quietly Hunnicide. I don't know just to say that. In political culture and whatever, but personally, I don't think they were this dramatically, equestrian people as we think about it. I mean, their ethos was probably massively influenced by individualistic attitudes. They surely know how to go on horseback. We know that. We have entire burials of Longobard horse archers But being a horse archer, and that's where you have to be flexible, is something that at that point existed already, basically in every single population that you encounter. And that's what a trick that we have. I mean, this idea that the West was somewhat more on foot, non-archery, like, I mean, it is very stereotypical, right? But we know, as a matter of fact, that that's one of the things you can't fully assess, how many archers were out there and how many horsemen were out there. And if you have the two, and you can find evidence for those in every single damn context in this period, where can you draw the line, right? And given that burials with horses, for example, are very rare, right? Or at least in the case of the Longobards, they are fairly common, considering that certain burials weren't even particularly expensive, display them. I mean, there's not the ultra elite only that gets buried with horses, but this is something you can find. Technically, I don't know. And that's where I don't know actually. Where, for example, the meter with which we can consider certain aspects, but I think that the real picture is much more difficult to concretize, as we think. But to make the long story short, what really the Longobards won the job is how, right? We don't know how many of these peoples were, or how many people they were. We don't know how they concretely, even how they interacted on the Pannonian Plain. We know that they were mostly settled, for example, and this is a very important indicator, along the mountainous areas, not in the flatland. Like people of the steppe, like the Avars, for example, if would ever arrived later, settled in the steppe, like the Huns would have done. These peoples preferred to remain essentially along the mountains, the forests, the rivers, and that's where they stood. And this seems to be, for example, a pretty good indicator that they weren't anything like a nomadic population that would exploit instead pastures and flatlands, because they had a lot of horses and they needed that for their raids and whatever. We know they didn't launch offensives on such a large scale like nomadic peoples do. We don't have any evidence at that point that the majority of their troops actually fought mounted. And even if we have an actual evidence that virtually all over migration era Europe, the majority of forces that are recorded of these Germanic populations did fight on horseback, in the sense that the sources, and that's where it gets complicated, evidently give a greater importance to the amount of cavalrymen, of knights, rather than something else. For example, the Longobards went in Italy, I don't remember with how many, to help the Byzantines with actually of consistent numbers of horsemen, and it said basically they had their own retainers. Now, who were these retainers? We don't know. We don't know whether they were the slaves, whether they were actual, maybe they were infantry, or maybe they were other mounted troops. We don't know. But we already know that, for example, cavalry was evidently very important for them, and we actually know it for many other things, archaeologically speaking, culturally speaking. For example, the Eastern Germans, and also the Longobards in this case, have always been credited for having a strong cavalry. And this is true, especially the Ostrogoths, which in fact were the easternmost of these populations settling in the Ukrainian plains, steppes, let's say, at one point were absorbed by the Huns, unlike the Visigoths that instead managed to break through the Roman borders and took another path. But even at that point, we think the Visigoths actually had quite of an equestrian cavalry, because the eastern half of Europe, let's say, was exposed unavoidably to all these populations that had fled the Huns, had integrated other populations. We don't know in which number, right? We don't know. When we think about the Huns pushing these peoples westwards, yeah, it happened, but by which degree? Now that's pretty difficult to assess. How do you do that? Like, genetic evidence is minimal. Like we renowningly who makes ethnogenetic studies with on actual the genetic remains of these people, they're not satisfied. They're insufficient to draw the whole picture of what these populations were. And we do know they were mixed. We do know that they were actually very composite in this for the same nature of what these migrations meant. Like they needed to stick together as much as they could, because whoever they were, because that was a good investment for surviving in that mess. On the other hand, we actually also don't know how many these people were. And what I often say is that, okay, yeah, this is probably extremely mixed situation for average standards of what these populations had been before, and this is also debatable, but how many of these peoples were actually there? I mean, how many Sarmatians could have been, pushed westwards to actually blend with others, with the Germans, let's say, or, how, these settlements were actually shattered, and how many people died, because we really don't know a lot of what happened, especially in the steppes. So where did all these people end? Did they die? I mean, consider that pretty seriously messed up things happened in the same western half of the empire. It was a time during the Gothic War in which Rome was completely inhabited, right? During the siege and the destructions. How do you think this could be like in the steppes, right? I don't think it would be very particularly nice, right? So there are all these question marks that you can't properly perceive, and we're saying the Ostrogoths and I don't remember what we're talking about actually, but I was making the example that still in the 8th century, the Carolingians tributed to the early Carolingians, by the way, at the time of Charles Martel, they tributed the Visigoths and the Longobards actually higher equestrian skills traditionally than the same Franks that by that time exactly were developing actually the strongest cavalry around, which was conceptually very, very different from the ones that had existed before, and not because they were technically more advanced. It's because they were politically and socially more predisposed to develop an elite professional cavalry, which is a very different thing, right, from sheer techniques. But you see that at that point, the Franks, that also were quite a proud, kind of a proud people on their own, and very, self-assertive as well as self-referential in many ways, from a military point of view. They recognized in this memory of the migration past, in this, shared Germanic identity that was perceived as such, at least in that point, that these peoples had a glorious past of cavalry, right? That, for example, in the for the Goths it was kind of stereotypical, because it was told, I don't know where specifically about the Visigoths, for example, also because, frankly, Spain, unlike Italy, had actually quite of an intense equestrian tradition, right, since long time. So, and for them, this is maybe unsurprising, but for the Longobards as well, that, as we have just said, actually in Italy they had lost with sedentarization their, kind of more, let's say, strongly equestrian character that seemingly they retain at the moment of the invasion. Well, they were considered as the good cavalrymen, and we do note that the elites of these people still considered themselves in the 8th century as essentially always picturing themselves as mounted cavalrymen, even if these people now were, I don't know, Longobard Duke, for example, was literate, was, he presided juridical assizes, they wrote, like, and then something very different from the Franks that were technically just and exclusively about war. They didn't understand anything about administration, about letters, about anything. They were rough and tough. There was only one thing that they knew how to do better than the others, in which they excelled, and that was war, right? But the world was changing as well. And other pictures, for example, other myths that we have collected. I don't know, that the Vikings used axes more than other peoples. That this is also myth that we don't know we get from, right? There is also, naturally, we could this is not just about the sources of the time. This is also about, I don't know, the 19th century fantasizing rather too much, right? About a lot of things, a lot of pictures, a lot of ideals. We think there are many incognita in this regard as well. For example, we didn't finish with the Longobards and the Gepids. Well, at that point, the indicator that tells you why the Longobards actually won is what? Is a grave finds. In these grave finds, what appears is that the Longobards had essentially a strong middle class. Right, we find a lot of tombs of relatively common people, common freemen, that were decently equipped. Like, they were toughly equipped with, for example, with spadae, with swords, which is, also interestingly enough, what in Germany, in the previous centuries, when they were still there, ironic, they didn't have. So, what we know is that by the time they settled in Pannonian Plain, the Longobards actually were on average wealthier per capita than they had been before, apparently, right? If you look at, and if you look at the proportions, of course you should be cautious, meaning that you should assess how many other, which are these grave finds, where they are located, to which contexts they belong, etc. But they are also pretty, I wouldn't say standard, but let's say pretty comparable in many ways, because the material culture was also fairly simple, right, and pretty homogeneous as well. Like, you can't say, another big problem is that these finds are not tagged. Like, you can't say, for example, there is a specific Longobard equipment, because the Longobards were equipped like this broader band of Central Europe that encompasses the Merovingian, the Thuringian, and whatever, this world that extends over even the Alemanni, over the Bavarian, was there, right? There is no way to get it, and this is actually a great helper, because it kind of flattens the picture at one point, highlighting the differences in this regard. The Gepids were something different, socially speaking, because from the grave finds of the Gepids we get, for example, that they had a much more stratified society, and with an imbalance for which there was an ultra rich elite that had a lot of individual power, but then the freemen were largely impoverished. Now, we don't know why exactly. I mean, in the history of the Gepids, maybe we could observe it more closely at one point. We will make a video on the peoples of the migration era series about them. But we have no other, we don't know about the military history of these wars. We know they fought, and also in which years, more or less, but we don't know much else. We know certain episodes later on told by Paul the Deacon, 200 years later. I mean, it's not and that is all kind of romanced in many ways. But we can assess that at that point the Longobards won the war, because they were a people that had crushed others in along the way. They had rough times. They probably had a strong, let's say, national, let's call it in this way, cohesion. The other term is ethnical. Meaning who was a Longobard at this point in terms of sticking together with that Traditionskern, as it's defined, around which were agglutinated all of these other elements, also coming from other ethnicities, etc. And that fought against a massive of Gepids that were essentially impoverished, tired. They didn't know how to make. They weren't inclined to make war anymore because they were too poor. They probably tried to settle down in an area that also was not dramatically evolved. Not even the Danubian area along the Pannonia was dramatically evolved. The Roman cities in there had declined and whatever. But the Japanese were probably much less cohesive. And what we get actually from other pictures also later on is that these peoples got weakened exactly at this point. Like those people who settled down, and all the Germanic peoples basically had this progressive evolution, like that they settling down, that they lost their warlike character, they turned into from warriors into peasants essentially. The elites began to have a more a heavier political and territorial importance in terms of domination and coordination of the populations, etc. And therefore this brought to a progressive stratification that either it developed an elite that could in a certain sense expand through warfare like the Franks did in the 8th century. Otherwise, and the Franks were the exception in the rule here, they would remain kind of progressively there with a complex weakening of the political and institutional structures. This is what happened to the Visigoths, for example. This is what didn't happen, telling the truth, nor to the Anglo-Saxons, nor to the Longobards themselves, but always bearing in mind that, of course, they also had the particular social certifications, just that their politics and institutions kind of evolved over time, unlike other peoples, in a kind of a popular dimension. Like this is also related naturally to the wealth distribution in the lands they had settled in. As we often say, paradoxically, the fact that Anglo-Saxon England and Longobard Italy had been devastated, before the settlement of these peoples was actually helping in consolidating the structures of these kingdoms, because they managed to reorganize the structures from scratch and not having to enter in conflict with local aristocracies like instead it happened in Vandal Africa, or even in Ostrogothic Italy at that point. That's what everything was razed to the ground, incidental. But even in Visigothic Spain, that had not an easy time to remain together, and its monarchy basically imploded in itself, and that's why also the Arabs had it so easy to conquer it at one point. Of course, as you see here, every history, every people has its own story, but at the same time, there are certain patterns you can cross here and to observe that they had similar characters, and certain dynamics had essentially the same nature, right? So, about their warfare, about their equipment, of course, among these Germanic peoples, and especially among the Franks and the Alemanni, but also, and secondarily, in terms of finds, in quantity of finds, the Burgundians, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Longobards, the custom required that the deceased had to be buried not only with his own best clothes and jewelry, but also with his weapons, right? And this practice had, certainly the direct result of diminishing, for example, the value of the inheritance that was owed to the survivors, and say to the heirs, depriving them of weapons that were often costly and precious, right? But the question is, why did some certain peoples did it more and certain other less, right? If it was just a matter of culture, you would simply answer saying, well, that in the Germanic tradition, like in many other pagan ones, the dead had to live in the afterlife, right? So, living, however, with essentially in the same way it had done as a warrior in life. This weaponry and armor was needed for the second life, which, telling the truth, was tied exactly also to those imprescriptible rights of succession that had, especially the mobile objects, let's say, that were to be distributed among their successors. This is important because it's still a mindset that doesn't entail sedentarization in part. I mean, this continued, of course, even with sedentarization, but with in this second phase, people also have land. So this changes a lot, even probably the same nature of what the grave goods were about in practice, not maybe maybe in the strict essence of what they would bury, right? But it's there's a different relation with wealth, and a different availability of goods, right? That makes it different. Of course, these practices stop with Christianization, and that's also what helps us understanding certain things, because there are peoples who Christianize pretty easily. Like if you look at the early medieval times, actually no people Christianized very quickly, right? As such, I mean, we do find this stuff for even for centuries after this interdisciplinary. But the problem is that there is a point in which you realize that they stopped burying with weaponry from a certain point onward. Like Longobards, for example, had this practice for in the mid 7th century. Essentially, they stopped burying with their weaponry. Right? You take the Alemanni from the other side of the Alps. They kept burying people with warriors with their weaponry for like throughout all the 8th century and beyond, and therefore it's a dramatically fast. And that's simply because they were never got quite Christianized. But even the Franks that technically converted formally to Catholicism pretty early in time, they at least their elites, they didn't. Also, they kept quite of a time burying people with that way, which proves a different political and cultural background that you must understand in the light also of the same political territorial organizations of these people. Like the Franks developed a monarchy that was fundamentally based on the idea of the militia and of the idea of defenders of the faith, etc., and were in this highly aristocratic culture that was shared not just by the Franks but also by the Gallo-Romans of Gaul, that basically they mixed with so to rule such an enormous land. There are many aspects of this regard. For example, the Alemanni seem to have buried even more richly than other peoples, even than the Franks, which is very interesting because you know that the Alemanni at one point got crushed at the Battle of Tolbiac by the Merovingians, and they are essentially incorporated within the Frankish Empire, even if the actual domination is very loose. And in fact, it's just under the Carolingians that these guys will be brought under control for a while, by the way. They were actually a Frankish Alemannic aristocracy at one point. So even the actual ethnical cohesions of these people was lost in part with the same sedentarization, in the sense that sedentarization first of all entails that you settle where there are other people who live there. And generally speaking, in this picture, the Germans got absorbed by an overwhelming majority of locals, right? Whatever, especially in Southern Europe. This naturally, if the local society was demilitarized, for example, take Italy. Italy from the 3rd century wasn't even, the Italians stopped even serving in the military at one point. There's all this cliche that essentially Italy had lost every kind of military character, that the populations were so easy and mild to control and all this stuff. Which is very debatable, also because the Italians at that point they Germanized massively in culture, which means that aside from the Byzantine held areas that from which the local population escaped because they didn't want to pay taxes to Constantinople. They joined the Longobards, and basically they were integrated as Longobards juridically within the as subjects of the Longobard kingdom. But even in there, they were, still, substantially civilized and especially wealthy and per capita area that, however, didn't have any, strictly warlike and military character, in the sense that, they weren't the guys living, I don't know, in the forests in the north, raiding each other just for surviving, for resources. They had trade, they had cities, for goodness sake. They could read in amounts that were completely unbelievable in other areas of Europe. They of course dealt something else, and that's why, in fact, we were talking afterwards of what the Longobards had become. Always bearing in mind, of course, though, that there are prejudices also in this regard, right? For example, I don't know, when the Franks, the Carolingians invaded Italy and they took out the Longobards, everybody said, oh, that was so easy. Well, it wasn't that easy. Like, the Carolingians put up an expedition with 2 columns. They had to cross the Alps. It was a major, probably the largest logistical operation, perhaps matched just by the Carolingian invasion of the Avar Khaganate on the Danube, but it took 9 months of siege to take Pavia, the Longobard capital, which is something you never find in Carolingian military history. The Longobards rebelled. At one point, we would think in the Venetian area, they even managed to crush the same Carolingian armies at one point. And they were, in fact, left by the Carolingians there, that, by the way, were, as dukes and as local rulers, and incorporated progressively over time, right? There were, this idea that, I don't know, that there are peoples that if you look at how big, for example, the kingdom of the Longobards was at the time of Carolingian conquest, well, was just one of the many pieces in terms of extension that the Carolingians already controlled all over north of the Alps, right? And that was a giant against a midget at that point. So the point is also, we don't understand what was the actual level of militarization of certain societies. Surely we see that certain were less or more, but we don't know effectively about their military organization. And also, in this sense, how many people were fighting like and with what in terms of actual equipment. But in terms of the Alemanni, which I forgot I was talking about before, what I wanted to say is that the Alemanni have this extremely rich burial finds. And the question, the thing is being explained, at least historiographically speaking, as a matter of political competition within the Frankish milieu, to prove essentially that the Alemannic chieftains were still kind of, co-optable by the Frankish elites of the empire for, for not ending up like kind of subjects, direct ones. And of course, the Carolingians ruled, at that point, the Merovingians ruled with, a large amount of decentralization. The same areas like Aquitaine or Burgundy maintained their own, even kind of national character. Like, this survived throughout the Middle Ages. Like, they didn't even speak the same language, essentially. Or at least it was something pretty mixed. There were different traditions. And as you often recall, even the Franks weren't dramatically different at some point, especially in Austrasia, to the Saxons, to the bordering Saxons, right? Even their laws, their customs, we know they were dramatically close. And thanks my eyes, the east towards you go, the more German that they became, the less infrastructures you find, the more similarities these groups shared. So naturally, what occurred in 8th century Francia with the rise of the Carolingians and the development of a professional mounted elite of heavily armored cavalrymen, well, that's well another story. Like that's the end of the migration era as such in the West. Like that's really the beginning of something. I'm not a huge fan of the term migration era by itself. Normally, the migration era ends up with the last invasion, which is the Longobard one, at least in the West, because technically speaking, the migration era lasts forever. Like in Eastern Europe, even in Central European part, there were other elements. There were Bulgars at some point. They were settled in. The Avars, for example, launched easily raids in Merovingian Germany. I think up to the Rhineland or Thuringia at least. There were Bulgars that at one point were settled by the Longobards in certain places of central Italy because they were wandering around. They had been, I don't remember the story, but they had been defeated by. And there's a lot of these stories, and there was also a lot of interconnection, a lot of exchanges between the same Roman and Germanic population. They were shared, for example, the various courts. They shared, first of all, of course, they intermarried, but they also had kind of adoptive sons in this way. Longobard kings were sent at the court of the Merovingians to have, or the Carolingians, telling the truth. Oh no, they were still Merovingians at that point, the beginning of the 8th century. I don't remember actually the episode, but I think it was actually in the 7th century still. Yeah, so it was still Merovingians to have their hair cut, which meant to pass into manhood. At that point, some Longobard king that had been exiled went to as far as Anglo-Saxon England. Well, that was pretty interesting, and we know that in the sagas actually it was all this famous echo, even of this migration era period of individuals like Albvin and other commanders that there was this shared perception of that the migration here had been a big deal. And the military culture in this context was somewhat shared between all these peoples. So that's also another hint about the fact that probably there was a past memory that had taken into account all of these individuals, and that you can find very early references to extremely old Germanic myths that got lost even into the, up to the fogs, even first century BC, and that's why I don't believe that there was such that there is an extremist current in this regard. Says that all of these Germanic traditions previous to the 6th century were invented, were fabricated a posteriori just to fit into a broader narrative of copying the ethnographic Helleno-Roman ethnography. Right? This is absolutely garbage. I don't believe it. Like it's obvious that the Germans, they didn't call themselves Germans, that it was a Roman ethnographical invention, but not that these people didn't have anything in common, or that they didn't perceive themselves as such. In some ways, and in comparison to others, which doesn't mean that you have to have a pregressed collective identity. You don't need that. It's not like that. It's as if you feel you're different from someone else, but all of a sudden you meet someone like Attila or Ezzius, and you have to deal with them, and you realize that you have somewhat something that you share compared to these guys. So obviously this happens later, but at the same time it's something they had. So the Alemannic example was pretty interesting, right? There is the sense also that in terms of cohesion, when you think about shields, right, just to make you understand how certain hints can work. For example, we think that the Anglo-Saxons in general, the insular Saxons, had, we know it from their burial finds, we know that they had relatively small shields, right? Weren't quite big. It's not that stereotypical large shield you find. That was probably effectively more widespread somewhere else, right? Probably along the eastern frontier, I suspect that shields were larger on average. What does this mean? Well, it's a bit difficult to explain, to make this fit in the narrative, in the sense I believe it's real. I believe that the Eastern Germans always had to cope with populations who were terribly skilled in horse archery. They need to counter that in some way. They had regular, kind of, average, medium-sized shields. They weren't immense because there is a limit even to they would have become too cumbersome. But for example, they had, we know it, lots of foot archers as well. Some of these were also slaves, serfs, like maybe some of those retainers we were talking about before, which also shows that infantry had a role in that regard. Archery is generally not, like, they are the weakest type of infantry in terms of melee combat, so it's not they were necessarily the proof of very resistant infantry. But we also know that, as we've seen before, that infantry weaponry actually is to be found among the especially the freemen, right? The average freeman, the middle classes. And you can say, how is that actually infantry weapon and not cavalry weapon? Given the weapons they were equipped with, but were also fitting into a broader, like they could be used both on horseback and on foot. Well, because certain lances especially seem to suggest that they were more fitting into a infantry combat, right? At least in terms of size and of general, even in combination with certain weapons. If you have a sword that at this point in the Sparta is thought to have been designed, for example, as chiefly as a cavalry weapon, right? Because it has a very shifted balance towards the tip, and therefore this is pretty damn effective from slashing from the above, right? And but at that point, you need a lance and horseback at the same time, but you can use the same thing on foot. And even if you definitely display, you can see this weapons used on horseback as well. You do realize from other hints, for example, the Strategicon. The Strategicon, this Byzantine manual of warfare, essentially, and depicts stereotypically all these populations, and it says blatantly that the so-called blonde-haired peoples that were essentially the Germans in that context, and more specifically, I think the Longobards, maybe we'll say the Franks, but at the time when the Strategicon was written, that, who was massively in Byzantine armies and fighting against the Byzantine armies at the same time, scattered all over the corners of the empire of Germans, were actually the Longobards. Yes, the Franks were allied with the Byzantines against the Longobards at that point, but they didn't have much of a contact. But the point I'm making, at least not as much as these other populations, but the Strategicon says pretty openly that infantry was a normal thing, and actually it even states that their infantry was fairly good, right? That they could be put in difficulty by uneven terrain, something like that, but they actually knew how to maintain a very good frontal cohesion of the ranks, and that speaks for peoples that theoretically, especially from the Byzantine perspective, they should have been kind of more Eastern Germans, right? And says there was pretty massive infantry in there as well, together with cavalry, the order of which, telling truth, wasn't very praised. Like the Byzantines wrote that these peoples charged very, very, disorderly, and they weren't good at keeping formation in cavalry, but they had this great impetus that was definitely made them the most courageous of all the barbarians, as that they were called. But when we talk about Anglo-Saxon England, these areas of the northwestern Germanic area, we realize these small shields that make you understand, first of all, these are lighter troops in a way or another, right? We get it. They're also poorer on average. They have less equipment than others. They're less socially and politically stratified. Look at even how the Anglo-Saxon invasions happened. They were all bands, essentially. They were all tribes on their own. They didn't even have at that point a kind of a cohesion, surely not even by identitarily speaking, and this lived on for a very long time in Anglo-Saxon England, that every place kind of had its own ancestral tribal sense of belonging rather than being part of a broader group. In this sense, peoples like the Goths or the Longobards that were, namely more surely, of course, more or less ethnically homogeneous. Actually, they framed themselves into a more orderly, more compact, more discernibly evident identity than these other peoples in the north did. And as a consequence, we think actually that these peoples saw much less of archery warfare than in the east and southeast. They were poorer, and therefore, and they also had much less cohesion overall as people. So they had smaller armies. They had a more individualistic mindset, and therefore this even lighter equipment was partly obliged, but also fitted into the necessity of in fact of being fast, more reliant, and needing to cope more individually with the enemy than other peoples did before. We probably had less cohesion, and the outskirts of Europe in the north had always been like that. I mean, even if you look at the Celts, for example, they weren't like the Britons back in the day, were kind of had the least. The lowest military quality of all the Celtic world, objectively, because they were poorer, less stratified, less cohesive. They had a more kind of heroic-like idea of warfare, but that corresponds essentially to a smaller degree of cohesion overall. Even the same Germanic peoples, let's call it this way, that lived in Scandinavia, well, the Germans got pretty tough and cohesive and kind of warlike as a people, more than else when they reached Central Europe. While they were in the north, there was still much more emphasis on the Saber rather than the comitatus, let's say, and this because Central Europe was more crowded and but also richer, and therefore there was more reason for fighting and competition, and this strengthened the cohesion of these peoples, for which they eventually formed confederations. They kind of built something more stratified over time. So actually these Saxons, these peoples coming in from the Jutland, but of the same Scandinavia, telling the truth, the same Saturn burial is being thought like being Swedish, telling the truth. And that's where these guys came from. Like, we think of the migration of the Viking era as beginning when Lindisfarne and whatever, but the Viking era was there since forever, basically. We've seen, it's at least the late antiquity. We know that there were Germanic pirates in the North Sea, and it was regular in this regard. So that's, for example, an indicator of probably a more dynamic, but also more individualistic and less cohesive warfare in the British Isles, for example, or in Scandinavia, for that matter. In parallel, let's say Viking era Scandinavia was much more structured and politically and socially stratified than we know before. We know chiefly about the Danes, actually, of the Jutland, and part of the Norwegians. We lack astonishingly informations from Sweden. Like, from Sweden we know a very, very few, and in part what we know, though, is that they had much in common even with the eastern peoples, even the Russian steppes, or forests and steppes, telling the truth. Great eastern influence, even of Sasanian origin as far as Persia, and that they had cavalry in the sense, even styled, modeled, kind of this closer steppes models that were actually pretty advanced, but still in a country that was fundamentally pretty primitive in its own regard, and that therefore maintained this individualistic ethos that maybe actually was lower than maybe Norway. We don't know. Maybe we'll have to look at it on another occasion. But Sweden actually developed as a centralized monarchy in much later, actually, of course, but also much later in relative terms to this other, to Denmark and Norway. So it would be interesting to expand in these areas that are normally credited as the Scandinavians, for example, didn't have cavalry, like the Anglo-Saxons. That's another garbage that doesn't end. It's like it's completely devoid of any substantiation. That's why I was saying, let's rewrite actually this all, because we know actually that there was cavalry in Scandinavia, and it also was pretty important for local warfare. and exported it as well. I mean, they brought it, during Viking era around. For example, the double handed axe, well, typical of the housecarls, etc. It was something that seemingly in Scandinavia appeared fairly late, and possibly actually by Western influence rather than of a strictly typically Scandinavian thing. But eventually it was a problem. Like the Scandinavians who got in Ireland, for example, were dramatically more advanced technologically for those time standards than the locals. The Vikings are considered like a bunch of lightly hipped raiders and pirates, but they had actually pretty massively built forces. Even at some point, even siege machinery. I mean, there was something that evidently we're underestimating by a certain amount. Of course, we don't have to exceed it. They were still what they were objectively, but military forces put in difficulty in several occasions in combat. Even the Frankish army at this point is the most advanced in Europe by all standards, and way more than the Viking, the Scandinavian ones. It's very meaningful. Of course, there is a greater cohesion as well. Think about even Anglo-Saxon England. I mean, Anglo-Saxon England, but during Viking era, was being molded in terms of a monarchy, etc. That also, in fact, benefited in terms of metus hostilis, in terms for putting together the monarchy itself in an otherwise pretty divided England. But the Anglo-Saxons were fairly well organized. They had their own structures, their own organizations, and the Vikings were pretty tough nut to crack for them as well on the field. So, as always, war is firstly moral and then technical. It's obvious that the Vikings had a particular mindset, a particular cultural background. They were probably more warlike on average than their continental or insular counterparts. But they objectively also were part of a world that we feel is separated from it, because the Scandinavians didn't write. They didn't seem to be. They were perceived and stilized as enemies, as heathens and whatever, as murderers and whatever. But they had their own context. They had always had their context. So what we often forget about the migration era is how peoples that had been wandering for Europe for centuries, at one point when crashed, or the things had turned wrong for them, they decided to go back to Scandinavia because they somehow recognized that was their homeland, and there was always this very strong contact, telling the truth, between these peoples and others. There was a very shared background. I like to stress very much the connections, for example, between the Anglo-Saxons and the Longobards. Very few people care about this, but objectively, aside from the fact that I was also presented with this information by a regular follower, that I hope he's listening to me, because at least he proved to be interested in stuff I said. I don't know how much I satisfy his curiosity, but he showed me, for example, it was from certain Italian and Hungarian archaeological sites attributable to the Longobards. There were strikingly similar genetic finds with Anglo-Saxon ones, I would actually English ones, and the reason being that the part of the Longobards, telling the truth, had remained in Germany, and they were incorporated by the Saxons, that kind of filled the gap left by the larger people that had migrated down to upstream the Elbe River. But at the same time, actually, the Saxons and the Longobards were quite friends, I mean, for what at this time it could mean. And in fact, during the Longobard invasion of Italy, lots of peoples joined, including allegedly 20,000 Saxons that came in Italy. And eventually they came back to Saxony from Italy because the Longobards basically wanted to assimilate them, to make them become Longobards ethnically, hence juridically. There were lots. There were Swabians, there were Thuringians in Longobard, Italy. I mean, it was that mixed, the Japids we've seen, but there were Sarmatians, Slavs, Romanized populations, Turks. In fact, in those samples, it was showed that the Longobards even had, in certain finds, have striking similarities, in minor part, of course, with today's Poland population. That's remarkable because we know, in fact, that the Slavs were actually expanding exactly around Moravia, around close to the Danube area, where the Longobards were about to leave the Pannonian Plain for Italy. And what else? Well, lots of things that make you understand here how can you think about the sax. The sax is an extraordinary, it was the secondary weapon. As you know, it was basically a large knife that even gives the name to apparently the Saxons as such. I mean, the Saxons being connected to it in part. These are hypotheses, but the sax was used basically by all peoples. There were actually Saxons even in the same Roman army. I mean, it was normal. It was pretty widespread, and these saxes were pretty useful. It could used as a secondary weapon, but also as a tool for cutting, skinning, whatever. And it's interesting because the Saxons apparently began to enlarge in after these populations settled down. At least this is the case of Italy, where certain Saxons reached the length of 70 centimeters, which means it's basically a saber at that point. And this is presented because it's a bit puzzling as an evidence. Like, if the saber is, curved weapons in general, like this single-edged big knife was substantially are optimal weapons for cavalry combat, right? At this time, telling the truth, the steppes hadn't quite developed much the type of design. Like, even the Sarmatians, etc., had essentially straight weapons. Even the Persians, these Iranian populations of the steppes, they were there. Like, the sabers arrived, were widespread a bit later, and also we don't know why. These are the big things. They're actually pretty important, but they probably have to do with problems of mass production, but also of training, because actually sabers are easier to use than other swords on horseback. So when, the Mongols much later arrived, they had these enormous armies. Apparently, actually, even the size has been overly inflated most of the times. Actually, the Mongols often fought outnumbered against their opponents in the West. But they bring a change in this regard. And the question is, if these peoples were so skilled in, horse ride, equestrian mounted combat, right? Why do sabers lengthened saxes lengthened when these peoples got settled down? Well, I remember when I studied this specific thing about Longobards, I realized that the simplest answer is that it is not true that sabers lengthened. We have basically certain finds that are datable to a certain age, more or less shifted towards the kind of beyond the second or third generation of Longobards settled, that at that point aren't even technically Longobards anymore because they blended with the rest of the population. But that's all the evidence, and it's just for one cemetery or another. I don't remember. And from there, there's been this categorization that is seemingly, in this case, sabers lengthened. Sabers, once again, Scramasaxes lengthened, and therefore now everybody thinks that this is actually true, that this thing got larger and longer, especially. And I don't know other finds of how this worked, even in Anglo-Saxon England, but this is typically actually a Longobard thing that I think derives exclusively from these. I think Casteltrosi, this cemetery is here. And that's how you build a myth, perhaps, because in my opinion, we have, the problem is, this is the real problem methodologically speaking, we have such a few finds that how can you say, on the base of these, that what you find in one reflects the picture of the whole thing? Like, it's You can't say that, but you still spread this myth. So at that point we could think that actually Saxons in a certain context were, I don't know, maybe it was the Longobards particularly that had this tradition, or maybe they simply developed it in there for reasons we can't understand. There was a lot of frontier warfare and cavalry warfare even in Longobard Italy, but the point is, also, why not? Like, what is that prevents you from, lengthening the blade of a sax, right? That's equally important. Now, talking about the Franks also, that are pretty fascinating and are by far the best documented people in terms of arms and armor for the time, because we have more evidence, more archaeological evidence and so on. There are also these kind of cliches. For example, the use of the Francisca, right, the throwing axe that, according to some, gave name to the people, which is actually not true, because Frank means free, essentially, and it stressed the initial very low political and social stratification of the Frankish Confederation that eventually the Merovingians raped as they created basically what was incredible for any Germanic standard, that is a dynastic monarchy, right? A Catholic dynastic monarchy, and also what made great the Franks in terms of power and in legacy, etc. I made a playlist on Frankish history, and I know that many of you are likely to come here from broader interest from like Frankish history, because I see in the analytics that most people search for Frankish history, Merovingian history, so this can be interesting for you as well. Well, first of all, the throwing axe is present literally everywhere in the migration period. I mean literally everywhere. There is not a single people that didn't use them. And this is even more remarkable. The Frankish throwing axe seems, telling the truth, this is also what Guy Halsall actually wrote, more of a Western invention. This the Franks seem to have developed this weaponry not when they were in Germany, but when they came in Gaul, in northern Gaul, in Roman Gaul, therefore. And we think that they developed this kind of weapon from existing prototypes of within the Roman army, right? Under which they served, by the way, because that's how they began in Gaul. And the throwing axe is a hell of a weapon, right? These peoples had axes habitually. We think stereotypically the Vikings had more axes than other people, but this doesn't seem like the case, because we associate the axe, I don't know to what, to cutting, trees or whatever. This is very stereotypical. Actually, we don't think that axes in any form belonged more to a certain people rather than another in this context, right? Not even the Vikings. And before, by the way, I said that double-handed axe for Scandinavia was kind of more of a Western invention. I got mistaken. Actually, I don't think this is true. At least I've never read it. What I meant is actually this one, the throwing axe of the Franks, was such. But even for the Vikings, probably we shouldn't be that surprised, in the sense that such heavily armored troops equipped with double-handed axes probably were, in a certain sense, a product of the Frankization and Westernization of local warfare. At least they're elites, and who can afford that kind of equipment and retinues, equipped like housecarls in that way, resents a lot of Western Frankish influences at that time. But anyhow, going back to the 6th century, it seems actually the Franks took the Francisca from the Romans and not the other way around. And we have plenty of evidence of throwing axes used on horseback, whatever, from even the Longobard kings used them, for example. There are evidence there are episodes with authority that uses it, and like a precision weapon, actually. Literally throwing them and hitting straight at a given target. And this requires, naturally, an amazing training, which probably was the pride of the elite, right? Because the elite already at this time, even if feudalism doesn't exist as such, but it's still they're still the guys who have more resources, more free time. They don't have to work the land, and therefore they can train all the time. And we know these peoples were obsessed with, military competitions, who was more men than the other, and so on. And therefore they trained. There were surely games like that. There were the so-called astiludia that are the forerunners of tournaments that were around since ever, basically. We know even Tacitus talks about such military games in ancient Germany, and they were widespread basically everywhere. Like every culture basically had things like this. Even the Romans had them, so at a tribal level. So it's really that simple. You don't have to stick to that as a particular feature of the Franks, because that is wrong. I mean, there's no evidence of that. It's just pictured by certain sources as that. What seems to have been instead, first of all, the Francisca was actually, we know it because we tested certain replicas pretty well, and we think they had an incredibly smashing power. Like, this thing really broke through shields and armor. It was a pretty massive blow it received. These weapons were thrown actually all together, preferably for breaking the cohesion of the enemy lines before the attack, the charge, and naturally the enemy would do the same. So naturally there was a symmetry in this that didn't quite solve the problem. Like many people reason in terms like, the Franks had the Franciscas, hence they had an edge over their adversaries. No, because everybody had them, and also everybody used them. So it doesn't make sense as a concept. But secondly, however, it was needed, like it was worked like that. And naturally, throwing them collectively is a bit of a different thing than doing it individually of our precision fire. The same goes for arrows and other projectiles, because in battle it's not about precision but accuracy that really makes the difference. And accuracy also in terms of rate of fire, of shooting together with all the others, throwing together with all the others, like in this case, to maximize the effect, so that you don't throw 60 Franciscas in a minute, like in just one in scattered throughout all the 60 seconds, for which the enemy can essentially parry the blows more easily. You throw them all in 1 second, 60 in 1 second, and that maximizes the effect. And then you charge, you close in, and you hopefully exploit the advantage. It's like the Roman pilum, right? And they did it like that in the same exact way, offensively. They charged, they got closer. They even had, the Romans had, as you know, the Roman pilum were of two types, essentially. They were designed actually for the different distance at which they threw it against the enemy. So the actually ancient warfare medieval was very, very synchronized, were very specialized in this sense. And the Germanic populations actually, on the influence of the Roman pilum, had developed another weapon that seems subjectively instead to have been more widespread among the Franks. This, yes, which was the angon. Now, the angon was essentially a heavy javelin. It could be barbed sometimes, and the concept is exactly, this has the same degree of penetrability of the Roman pilum, and it's used exactly in the same way. And there are stories from Agatius, for example, who say, they threw these things tied to a rope so that they pierced the enemy's shields, and then they threw it away with the rope, or they tried to destabilize the enemy like that, which is a bit mechanicistic and doesn't quite fit. But individually these things are possible. But the most important thing is collective, employment of these weapons, and naturally we know that they use them in these ways. Consider also, as we often say, that most of battles were occupied just with skirmishing, like renowningly melee, something dramatically short, brief. Battles can last an entire day, and the melee can last just, I don't know, half an hour. Like it's like that. So actually, these throwing weapons are very important and overlooked, and that's where we get to bows and how they were used, because actually there is a lot of debate on this too. Maybe not much for the migration era, but rather for later times, because basically we get this impression, especially with the aristocratization of warfare towards the High Middle Ages, that certain throwing weapons, for example like slings, tend to disappear. Like up to the revival of crossbows, that is in fact mostly a middle-class commoner's weapon. There is this idea that feudalism has disarmed the rural populations that at this time had passed from, the ancient, like the Germanic freeman warriors into essentially medieval peasants, land workers, serfs, and so on. It's possibly true, but there is also this idea that the bow is the weapon of the coward. Like the idea in the West, unlike in the East, that essentially the bow is something not so noble as an art. Like that, all in all the sagas, that the hero is killed by, in a treacherous way, and sometimes by a projectile weapon, and it's plenty of this, and this actually speaks the truth in many ways. There's some things you find even in in the Iliad, or in classical Hellenic warfare, that this idea that the freeman fights face to face, and that these guys are kind of cowards because they throw weapons at the distance, but they always appear. Like they're never protagonists, or rarely protagonists at least, but they are always there. And this probably reflects what warfare was really like, also in the migration era. Like there was plenty of bows, and we know that in Roman times, in Denmark we find entire 30 long-bows in one stock in a swamp, and later on we know there was plenty of longbows among the Vikings, but other peoples as well. The longbow is just literally a long bow, so any person big enough to draw it on a regular base is going to use it, because weapons are modeled on the basis of who uses them. And the bow is a pretty effective weapon, and in my opinion was developed, in the ancient world objectively. The bow in Europe doesn't seem to have been a big deal. Like we know that there were these types, longbow is a prehistoric weapon, for example, but the ancient world doesn't spark for particular use of bows. Apparently, the sling was also very more conveniently used, but also here we can get somewhat disoriented by prejudices and so on, but we don't know, quantitatively speaking, how much this is true or not. But there is this impression that the Germanic peoples, especially those who migrated eastwards, kind of adopted bows more massively than their Western counterparts. The reason being that they acquainted enemies from... First of all, they traveled more. And traveling more in the migration era means that you have to fight more people and therefore make more slaves in case you survive. And slaves are disarmed, also for obvious reasons of security, but you can't make them use the bow, which is a kind of a light weapon, and these guys can't do anything without cavalry support, and they're actually pretty vulnerable to it. But they're, in combination with cavalry and other infantry, they can be pretty deadly for cavalry too, in that sense. And this is very interesting because I think that actually all the Germanic peoples, with the possible exception of the Ostrogoths, remained prevalently on foot, contrarily to what is commonly thought. Like, they probably all knew how to use a horse in battle, but this doesn't mean that in battle they actually used it. And this has nothing to do with how much they were culturally predisposed for using them. It's like the Anglo-Saxons. It's not true that they didn't use cavalry in combat. They did. Like, preferably they liked to dismount, etc. And guess what? Because cavalry at the time wasn't simply that effective like it would become later. So it was obvious that most of the times it would be preferable to fight on foot once you arrived on the battlefield. But this has literally nothing to do at the slightest to being more or less predisposed, be more or less capable to mounted combat in general, right? Of course, yes, depending if there are peoples like the nomadic ones that fight just on horseback, well, that's another story. But it's actually false that this is the case, and we have actual evidence of mounted combat even in Anglo-Saxon England, and of an enormous adaptability. Just look at Harold Godwinson, and where he fought and how he fought. He fought like a Norman in Normandy on horseback with iron troops. He fought on foot like an Anglo-Saxon traditionally did. He fought on the Welsh frontier with kind of lighter cavalry that he styled from his Anglo-Saxon troops and others that to fight the Welsh that had mostly kind of a skirmishing tactic. So the myth that these peoples didn't fight on horseback is utter garbage as well. But the point is, up to the point in the East, the Germanic peoples met with lots of like the Sarmatians, the Huns, and the bow is actually an extremely effective anti-cavalry weapon. Like, horses are big targets. They are, in order to be effective, they are massed, and at that point they can overwhelm pretty much everything in certain contexts, except infantry that at this time is on average kind of tougher than cavalry still. But they're very easily targetable, and they're vulnerable because horses normally, not even in the steppes, are armored by the large majority. Like, the steppes peoples normally have this ultra heavily armored elite, but that is also quantitative elite. The rest is light horse archers. So in order to cope with these guys that are also pretty excellent archers on their own, the Germans that didn't have this equestrian culture coming out from the forests of Central Europe, what they do is, in parts, they of course learn how to fight on horseback and to have their own horses and to develop their equestrian zootechnic techniques, abilities, but at the same time to develop. They're still infantry armies essentially by large numerically, and therefore they arm these light guys, these serfs, these poorer peoples with bow. And this is to be found basically in every single early medieval and high medieval law recruitment of Romano-Germanic Europe. You equip your troops with bows. The Romans actually did the same in late antiquity. They had the same exact thing, and part of the reason, especially also if you look at the Byzantine world, is that they were on the eastern frontier against the Sarmatians and the Persians that fought essentially in that same way with the horse archery. So since the West is more sanitarized and the Germans actually fit in this thing, it seems that these infantry archers were actually pretty prominent and they were, if not the most, in relative terms, the most widespread type of fighter. However, they got pretty close to it, and in certain cases they surely were. And the laws of recruitment, you find these these archers pretty much everywhere. Even in the highly gentrified Longobard Italy of the 8th century before the Carolingian conquest, you find that the lowest strata of the population bow and quiver as a standard equipment, minimal equipment. But you find this even in feudal Europe. So this makes you think, did actually these guys in the migration era were more versed for, in using bows for reasons like countering horse archery than others did? Other times, like even during Middle Ages, probably. Surely societies were more militarized during the migration era that they were in the full Middle Ages, in the sense that theoretically every freeman had to fight and did fight. In medieval times, like a 40% maximum in certain areas, could happen. Like, it depends also on where and how, but we think that, 18th century Frederick the Great's Prussia was militarized. Look at the Middle Ages. Look at the percentage in terms of population that took arms on a regular base, and see how militarized actually Middle Ages was. So how can you count that? How can you measure that? It's very difficult to answer this. But it's also obvious that the average freeman out there in Central Eastern Europe would be way more acquainted with the use of bow than the average European peasant of the high and later Middle Ages. Because at that point, it makes a difference between, of course, we don't have to think of the migration era period of, professional sharpshooters knew how to do everything with the bow. These guys essentially knew how, on average, just to I mean, I'm talking about the lower strata, the majority of the population. They knew how to hunt with that. And hunting a person is actually very simple as well. So there is that's not even important. The important is how these troops are collectively brought together on a field and how they can shoot kind of together with a certain order and connection. And we know that it's not easy. So at that point, the real difference is not how much the bows are used on the field. I mean, in terms of how many people are equipped with that, but actually how they are used and what political cohesion there is within that community, which is particularly important. And for that matter, actually, all these Germanic armies were pretty much the same. Like, if you really want to get to that realization, there is actually no difference. I don't see any. Like, of course, you see more Eastern styles in the Eastern Germans than in the Western. But essentially, you find the same weaponry in different proportions, but essentially in the same measures when it comes to make a difference, right? So, I don't know, if you look at the average Longobard bodyguard, like you find in the Agilov's Plague, well, that guy, those bodyguards basically look like the perfect prototype of what all noblemen have looked in the steppes from the Pannonian Plain to the Bering Strait for millennia. Like, they look exactly like a lamellar armor covered from head to toe to toe, actually not, but to thighs, let's say, like that, and they look exactly like. There is no difference between that and another knight. They're literally the same, but this doesn't mean that they are actually the same as an army. They are different. They fight in a different way. So actually, weaponry and armor are quite tricky by themselves because they suggest things that normally aren't there. Like, being equipped in an identical way to someone doesn't actually mean that as an army you fight in the same way. Many people, for example, are convinced that I don't know, since in the Mediterranean, the Iron Age Mediterranean, Hellenic armor was spread everywhere. It means that actual people who wore like hoplite armor, they fought in phalanxes. It didn't happen like that by the slightest, and that's why there's a lot of people who actually think, for example, that the Romans fought like Hellenic phalanges, which actually didn't happen historically. But many people are actually convinced 100%. You find it in many manuals and historical books still, and the people will say no, it is true because they had it. Look at their Tullian, military organization. That's how they were. They don't realize certain things because these things are mainly cultural. They have nothing to do with that. They're mainly political and social. They're nothing to do with the technique or the particular weapon in itself. So actually, personally, I believe that these peoples, as Germanic peoples, as east as they got, actually they were pretty much much more sedentary looking as an army, much more footed, let's say, than is often believed, which has nothing to do with the actual individual capabilities of these guys to ride a horse. Of course, they knew how to do it, and they knew how to fight with it, but you can't think even horses were like a public dominion. And even if they had been, that's not a good indicator because it means there's not enough centralization that can dispose of these means effectively, can give them an order, a cohesion, a discipline, right? So it's actually quite important to look at all this. We're not talking about all the Roman element. Today we didn't talk much about that, but as we began the video, we were stating that. I mean, the fact that Roman legionnaires and Germanic warriors at this time weren't actually that different. Actually, were pretty similar, if not identical. And at that point as well, there was a great difference in terms of training, of military background in general, that made the difference on the field. and brought to these stereotypizations and characterizations that we have, however, to be always very careful with, because at the same time, the differences, especially within Europe, these tactics and military organizations were pretty small, pretty small, and they had always been that. But at the same time, there is one character of the migration era warfare that is very important, that is the progressive, let's say, polyfunctionality of the elite warrior. Like, there is an aristocratization of warfare, which is present even in the Roman army, telling the truth. And the point is that soldiers get trained for a longer time. Even in the Byzantine army, the training lasted much more, for example, than it had lasted, I don't know, in Augustan times. It was much faster. Also because, in fact, the techniques involved were much more varied, in many ways much more sophisticated and advanced than before. And never get tricked in terms like crisis doesn't mean going backwards. There are many changes that you're forced to undertake in order to get better, to survive, right? That's exactly what happens within these people, and that's also why the militarization of these peoples brings to stratification, and that's really the key for understanding this period. Like, these peoples are changing. They are not a bunch of freemen led by their oligarchies in a tribal context. Now, these guys are getting highly hierarchically organized and stratified, and they are fit into kingdoms with a territorial dimension. The territorialization of these peoples is the centralization. It changes literally everything, and they become essentially what the locals were. And we know, in fact, that the same Roman societies were quite hierarchical, like quite stratified, and at the same time, there are other options as well that maybe today we don't have the time to discuss, because we are talking chiefly about weaponry, but it's obvious that there are certain symbols that are becoming really important here. Like the funerary corredum for a man had to comprehend in complex with the of his Heergerät, vestis bellica in Latin, weapons, equipment, and war horse. Like, if you weren't buried with a war horse, were probably less than the others, and this was normal because not all the freemen were buried like this. And the concept is also that this usage seems to be generalized to get generalized towards the 6th century, right? And what is interesting is that the same Romans, or at least populations of Roman origin, become to adopt it. Maybe because it had become easier to get weapons and other reserve equipment that could be employed for burial, right? Or maybe because the number of who practices these burial rituals is larger. This is very difficult to explain now, but what it means is that, of course, the Roman state had fundamentally tried to has succeeded in demilitarizing the local populations when the Germans arrive. And the social order is already broken chiefly, and therefore all these local aristocrats have already taken power. There are maybe even bishops, there are senatorial elite that are actually telling the truth, the same people most of the times, and therefore they get Germanized in turn as much as the Germans get Romanized. So it's obvious, as we have seen with Christianization, that this ends, but that there is also one factor to consider, is that what we find is essentially the tomb of the rich people, right? The war horse is not for the poor freeman that had his plot of land and just trying to make a living on his own. It was too poor, he was too poor to afford that. So there is a limitation in terms of time span for observing these finds, and also of space, sometimes, and of socio-economical condition. You can't deal as if, this was important, this didn't count, and this can can really create a problem in terms of how to evaluate certain military dynamics, because the burials by themselves just mirror certain military dynamics, but they actually don't tell you how it really was out there, how many people were armed and how they fought, especially. So this is all very fascinating, because this was a video just about we can take as an introduction to certain topics, but it's obviously, everything is obviously way more complicated than how I put it here, and it should be studied case by case, and that's why we thank archaeologists, and we should read more about what they write, and being confronted with these problems, because actually these are pretty clearly understood by whom studies these things. At the same time, we should always reflect on the broader military context that cannot be reduced just to, like, okay, this was a ritual thing. Of course, it still had a meaning, that it mirrors a certain reality that we should be able to extrapolate in some way. But it's also very difficult to reconcile this with actual dimensions, like how many people could afford this burial, how can we have an actual cross-section of, I don't know, Frankish society in the 6th century. We must study a lot of other sources in order to get there, and wonder lots of other things. There were many, I don't know, for example, there were many Roman units, as you know, that remained within the, for example, when Clovis conquered the kingdom of Syagris 486, was one of the relics of the Western Roman Empire. Well, lots of Roman soldiers became effectively mercenaries, Frankish mercenaries at that point under Clovis. The same goes for the Romano-Britons, about which we know astonishingly few, but we know that when the Romans left at the beginning of the 5th century, they left their administration, including the military one, and something brutal happened in there, telling you the truth. We know it because actually I think before the Anglo-Saxon invasions, all the field borders had already been reshaped. So whatever happening there was pretty brutal, and this also tells you, by the way, how much of the pre-Roman political and social stratus was still kind of, pre-Roman in the sense of, say, in parallel with Rome. How much the local communities were observing, wishing for a kind of a degree of autonomy, let's say, that they couldn't get, right? That were areas of the Roman Empire, like in northern Gaul, and in northern Spain, for example, or in Britain, for that matter, the Bacaude, right? That's rose once Rome basically began to vanish in the areas, and they were a great problem. Actually, that began immediately, very early in time. There were major rebellions even during 12th to 3rd century. So the picture is really that complicated, and we often forget that also the Roman Empire was actually a cluster of different populations rather than like many would like to see it, like a modern secular national state where everything is equal and right, that everything is standardized, homogenized. It wasn't like that at all, right? And especially starting from the military, because, by the way, considering all this picture that the migration era warriors were all kind of schooled by the Romans in this sense. These peoples had for centuries served in the Roman armies, even coming back where they had come from originally, and they learned everything. The Romans had their own share, of course, of disciplinary standards, tactics, techniques. I mean, they had definitely the most advanced military, and going to fight for them was also learning a lot. And definitely by the 5th century, especially in the West, all of this had been blurred because it was basically federati next to the Roman army and fighting alongside or against actually each other, and that was very meaningful, even for hybridizing the military cultures, the various tactics. And in fact, I don't want to stress too much here the concept of the Germans versus Romans. Actually, this is really about migration here. It's more like barbarians versus Rome, and the idea that this whole world gravitated around Rome, even when in certain provinces the Roman government disappeared, right? And tomorrow maybe we will look better at this again, but in terms of, especially of political culture, especially of the idea of the military potestas, fundamentally, the idea of effectively ruled, and on behalf of whom, in certain lands. And there are very interesting things, and in that regard I think we still have to investigate pretty thoroughly, historiographically speaking, because we have partly forgotten them since the Renaissance and the also with the Enlightenment that didn't quite help in some regards. But aside from this, I hope this is essentially what I want to talk to you about. I don't think there is anything left. I mean, there is a lot left, of course, with lots of other things we could talk about, but we will do it maybe on another occasion. And for now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.